Hello and welcome back to My World History with Us and Power. And we are looking at Unit 4. We're in the age of absolutism. And what better way to pick up the pace on this and go into the next level of absolutism than to look at the absolute best example. And that is the French Sun King, or that is Louis XIV. So let's talk about France for a little bit. Louis XIV was the best, and I do mean the best example of a absolute monarch. All right? And really, you're gonna learn right here that the art it isn't just as easy as divine right, controlling the masses. You aren't just born into power that people are going to respect. What Louis XIV does is he figures out ways to control the nobility that rivaled his power. And it starts actually a little bit before him with a guy named Henry of Navarre. Alright, so let's talk about it. Remember the Protestants, remember the Catholics and the dispute that's going on. So, after Henry II, there was going to be a bunch of weak kings in France, all the way up until this guy named Henry of Navarre comes to power. Alright, so Henry of Navarre is different by a landslide because he is a Huguenot. In other words, a French Protestant. So Protestants in France were called Huguenots. So you just have to remember that. And as a Huguenot, his reign was already very, very controversial. He's obviously going to make policy that is more favorable to religious tolerance and things like this. They're really going to make Catholics pretty mad. So the name of the law that he enacted was called the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes is how you pronounce that. And it was an edict that promoted religious tolerance. And since France had really been heated between Catholics and Protestants for some time now, this right here didn't look good from the Catholic perspective. And so Henry IV's reign did restore peace, but he was killed by a hater. And because obviously some of his policies, like the Edict of Nantes, was very, very outrageous, and people didn't like his religious compromises, is what they saw it as, religious compromise. And so it's also important to note that Henry of Navarre made religious compromises in both directions. He truly was trying to do what was best for the collective benefit of all of his subjects. Now, after Henry IV, you're going to have another series of weak kings. And in particular, this guy, Louis XIII, is a total inept king. He had no power at all. And so he appointed Cardinal Richelieu, as you can see here in the picture, Cardinal Richelieu to be basically the real authority figure here, to call all the shots. So he was the king in practice, but in reality, Cardinal Richelieu here had the power. All right, had power. He was calling the shots. So basically, Richelieu was the ruler of France. He did a few things. First, he was Catholic. So he increased the power, his power, by making it illegal for Huguenot cities to have walls. So if you don't have walls, you don't have protection against, for example, Richelieu's army if you fall out of line with him. So if he decides he wants to attack Huguenots and try to get rid of them in his kingdom, he can do this now because it's illegal for Huguenots to have walls in their kingdom. By the way, if you have walls and you're a Huguenot city, then now that's justification for attack. No fortified castles for nobility. Alright, so in other words, no nobles were able to have castles that were fortified that could, again, prevent attack. And he relied on middle-class agents to kind of keep him informed about what's going on in his country. This here is kind of a new technique that you're going to start seeing happen a little bit more and more. But this also really reduced the power of his political rivals. Alright, so if you got people keeping tabs on your subjects, they don't have an opportunity to gain power over you because you can stop it before it happens. And so Richelieu really did kind of amass a lot of power in France to himself or to the crown, however you want to say it. He was able to take a lot of that power. He also challenged the Habsburgs by entering the 30 Years' War. So we're going to talk about the 30 Years' War a little bit later on. But basically in Europe, you've got two big dynastic groups, the Bourbons and the Habsburgs, and really the two of them share the European power. And there's always this emphasis on trying to promote this balance of power that's going to prevent one side from getting too strong. So that's really kind of what was happening here during the 30 Years' War. So Louis the XIV ends up emerging in this. Cardinal Richelieu is in power, but eventually Richelieu is going to pass on, and you're going to have a new cardinal named Cardinal Mazarin. Cardinal Mazarin is going to come into the fray during the reign of Louis XIV. Now, Mazarin was very, very disliked. There were problems with nobility, as you can see from our discussion already. Richelieu tried to rein in power over nobility, and nobility, I think, oftentimes would fight to get a little bit of that back. I mean, people don't like to give up their power. So there were problems with nobles, and they disliked Cardinal Mazarin and led to a rebellion in which Louis XIV almost died as the heir to the throne. The nobles got into where he was staying and almost killed him while he was a child. And for this reason, he always kind of had a fear of nobility, and he passionately hated them. He swore that he was going to weaken their influence in his kingdom, and he excluded them from his councils. All right, and so during the time that Louis actually once he became king himself, and once Mazarin is out of the picture, he didn't appoint a new cardinal. He wanted to have that power himself, and so in doing so, this is where he starts to kind of take the power back from the nobility. And so he also had these intendants, very similar to what Richelieu had. He called them intendants. They were his government agents that helped him to keep the nobility in check. He was able to know what they were doing. He also hired Jean-Baptiste Colbert for economic reform. And so Colbert helped him to kind of appeal better to the French people. Eventually he's going to also fire Colbert, which is probably not a good move, but because of the financial problems that he ran into during his reign. But Louis XIV required nobles to live in his palace. Now, let's take a look real quick at this. The Versailles Palace, as you can see, was nothing short of completely amazing. It had running water. It had these gardens that you can see here. I mean, it truly is just the most fantastic structure that you probably would ever see. I've never been there, but you can see the images here speak for themselves. I have been to the Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina, and this here would probably be so much bigger and more extravagant than that. It's just an astonishing piece of architecture, and really an astonishing show of the power of the absolute Sun King. So it really was a show of power. I mean, a show of power. You just can't have something like that if you don't have a huge amount of wealth and power to keep it up. So Versailles was not in Paris, but was kind of on the outside of Paris, a few miles away, and he required nobles in his kingdom to live with him. If they live with him, he has the power to keep them in check. If you're a 30-year-old married man and you lose your job and your family has to move back in with your parents are going to have some degree of power over you. In the same way, he was able to have power over his nobility. Louis was also a major patron of the arts. So remember what this is. This means he is someone who's going to pay for and sponsor artists to do art. And so he was also very much, he loved theater, so he would watch and partake in plays. He loved to read, so he very much was a major patron of the arts. He also used that to promote his absolute rule. Many of the plays, for example, would be about him and about his greatness as king, among other things. There's also these artworks, like the one that we saw at the beginning of this video. So under Louis XIV, France was the most powerful country in Europe. But, you know, as is the case with Spain and among others, wars to increase territory exhausted France. They got involved in a lot of wars, including the War of Spanish Succession. And there wasn't enough money, even for the great Sun King, in order to continue this extravagant living and also fight these wars. And So Charles II died, by the way, the War of Spanish Succession. Charles II died and left Spain to Philip of Anjou, which was Louis XIV's nephew. And this right here is going to be too much power to the Bourbon monarchy. And so that was the reason for the War of Spanish Succession. But essentially, Europeans chose sides in order to preserve the balance of power that I mentioned earlier in this video. Britain, during the War of Spanish Succession, was the real winner, and France lost territory as a result of this. So by the time that Louis XIV was on his deathbed, the French were quite glad to see him go due to the economy and how terrible things were at the end of his time. He left France in a huge amount of debt and economic ruin. So he held on to power very, very well during his time as leader, but there were also consequences for that. We're going to look at and see how other kingdoms and kings held on to power in the next video of the unit on absolutism. Thank you for watching.